Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring you the third in our series of programs entitled The State of Prejudice in America Today. As I indicated to you last week and the week before, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment Incorporated, a new organization, has recently conducted a convention in our city and have been so kind to allow us to bring all their speakers before you through this program. We're going to add to that today with two more speakers that addressed that recent convention. To my left is Congressman Larry Craig, representing the 1st Congressional District of Idaho. He was elected in that district in 1980, re-elected in 1982, 1984, and 1986. Our second guest is Anabelle Jaramillo, who is just finished her second term as national president of NWCAMH, which is a national Hispanic organization. She is very involved and has been excellent in her work on behalf of Hispanic people in employment discrimination. I could go on for a long time with both of these people as to background, but I don't want to take away from the fine questions and answers that we will receive. We'd like to welcome to the panel to question our guest. To my immediate left, State Senator Mary Lou Reed, who will be joining in the questioning, and next to her is Glenn Walker, Kootenai County Prosecuting Attorney. And I would invite Mary Lou Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome Congressman and Anabelle. Anabelle, I am compelled to start this program on a personal note because I want to know a little bit more about your remarkable mother, who, when you were a very small child, insisted that you sit in the superintendent's office rather than permit you and your siblings to go to segregated classes in Colorado. Would you say a little bit about that and what gave her the strength to do that?
Well, first of all, she's a very remarkable lady. She's all of 70 years young, and she's a bilingual teacher's aide for the Forest Grove school system in Oregon. Her belief in making sure that children get an opportunity to an education still has her, and that in that type of employment, I guess if I look at her now, I guess she was into that same sort of programming early on in life when she kind of have us sit in the superintendent's office, if you will. Where I grew up was in Center, Colorado, and at that time they had segregated classrooms for Spanish-speaking children and white Anglo students. And we had been taught before we entered school to speak English, so we were very fluent in both languages. And so it was an insult to her, and I think maybe that raised her hackles a little bit, that it was insulting to have her children have to go through that kind of discrimination. So she took it upon herself and quite successfully integrated the grammar school there with myself and my two sisters and my little brother. I guess it was a first in that community.
That's a wonderful lead into the whole question of the current push for English as the official language or as the only language. Congressman, I don't really know what's going on the congressional level with the drive to make English the only official language. Do you have a position on that, and can you bring us up to date on
Mary
the congressional
Lou,
election?
There's been an effort through both the legislative route and also for a constitutional amendment. Now, I know that some view that as a narrowing, if you will, or a targeting of certain minority groups. I have supported not a constitutional amendment per se, but I have supported recognizing English as an official language of this nation, and at the same time encouraging the necessary federal programs that will allow transitions, so that in the public schools of this country we have a commonality of language that we encourage our peoples to move toward, while at the same time recognizing both the individual community or that may be made up of a particular minority group and their desire to perpetuate their own language and their own cultures. I don't see those as conflicts, but I do see it important for the cohesiveness of a nation to work toward the speaking of a common single language.
Thank you, Congressman. Anabelle, would you respond to that, please?
I think that's easy to respond to. I think within the Hispanic community, you will find support for what you're saying, And that support is in that we have to have a commonality of language which will enable us to communicate and put forth the business of the nation. The dangers of amending the Constitution to make English the official language says a lot of things. It gives permission to enact laws which will disenfranchise people based on language, on issues such as language. It may take away the impetus of teaching proper English or teaching English to non-English speakers in terms of taking away programs that move towards that end. So when you legislate it in terms of making it an official language, you set in motion something that could be very dangerous, that sets up precedent, sets up rules to keep it in keep it moving in that direction. I think one thing that needs to be recognized with the Hispanic community, and this is raised a lot by the English-only people, is the nationalism, if you will, that's demonstrated in Quebec, Canada. I think it's a quite different issue here. I do not think that nationalism is the issue here. I just simply think it's a reactionary issue that has brought the English-only movement forward. I agree with you, we need to have commonality of language. I don't think a constitutional amendment necessarily brings that about.
Thank you.
Glenn Walker.
Well, Congressman Craig, in the state of Idaho, you served for, I think, 6 years as state senator, and since the time you left, most of the issues that we're dealing with now with regard to prejudice in Idaho, since you left our legislature and went to be a member of our national government, our legislature has been, I think, has reacted well to the problems that we've had, and we now have a Malicious Harassment Act, we have a Terrorist Control Act. The latter is patterned on federal civil rights legislation. Can you think of anything else that the federal government should be doing with regard to prejudice? Obviously, we can't legislate decency, but we've had a number of good civil rights acts that have helped in this regard. Should we be doing more as a national government?
I guess my reaction to should we be doing more is that there is a role that the federal government must play in areas of civil rights. We have legislated, I think, as far as we can legislate in the establishment of national policy that in large part determines a course of direction. Now I think we have to recognize a constant vigil that enforces the law, that is assured that we're going to provide equal access under the law. For example, in the past 4 years in the area of voter rights and voter rights legislation, although there have been attempts to move that, there has been more enforcement, more direct involvement on the part of this government in assuring that people gain access to the polls and are registered than ever in the history of our government. And that's something I'm very proud of, because if minorities are to come full stream into society in this particular style of society, then being able to vote, feeling comfortable in accessing the voting booth, feeling no sense of harassment is absolutely critical. And this administration has worked very hard in that area.
Well, certainly the Justice Department in the areas that I'm most involved with has worked very hard in these areas. The FBI, the U.S. Attorney's offices around all over the western part of the U.S. and the Midwest have been very, very active and have done a very good job. I would ask Ms. Jaramillo to follow up on Congressman Craig's reaction. As a leader of a national Hispanic organization, what do you think the government ought to be doing more than it's doing, if anything?
In the area of voter registration, in which
I'm looking at the whole overall issue of prejudice.
I guess, Congressman, I don't quite view it in the same way you view it, because I think we tend to feel that there really hasn't been enough done, not in terms of that the laws aren't in place. The laws are in place. I feel concerned that the laws are not being enforced in a lot of areas. I see that when you look at voting patterns, for instance, in the state of Texas. Now, there's still gerrymandering of districts going on there. That disturbs me. And I'm sure that if you look in certain areas of the South, you can see the same sorts of things. So when you talk about law enforcement, there is law enforcement in some areas, but there isn't in other areas. So I'm not quite as feeling as positive about what has happened in the last few years. In fact, I think in some cases we've gone backwards.
Well, I've heard about the argument of gerrymandering, and I am reflective of what Phil Burton did in the state of California to gerrymander that state into hardcore Democrat versus hardcore Republican votes. So I guess it's in the eye of the beholder. He was not criticized for really dividing up the state of California in 1980 because he happened to be of the Democratic Party. But when a Republican administration oftentimes doesn't do the trappings or the symbolism often that a Democratic administration does, but I think has been very effective in the area of justice and law enforcement, really being pretty hard-nosed about the laws that are on the books, that they deserve more credit than they're getting. And the thing that I am oftentimes frustrated about is that we will be critical because the trappings aren't there, but we fail to honor or to recognize the real hardcore work that's been done down in the trenches that I think sets the tone long-term for the validity and the effectiveness of the laws that are currently on the books.
I guess I still have to argue the point that having been part of the federal bureaucracy for some time, we saw a moving away from that. The message early in the late 70s, early 80s, was that there were certain laws in terms of civil rights that had to be pressed forward, especially in the areas of affirmative action, and we've seen the federal bureaucracy take long strides backwards in that area. And I think it all comes down to no clear direction from the Justice Department, no clear direction from the Office of Personnel Management, and no clear direction from any law enforcement, any civil rights law enforcement entity. And I guess that still, to me, goes back to the top. I don't think there's a strong voice there. That's how I view it.
I would like to get into an area that a lot of us have had some experience with and observed, and there are people on this program that have had to deal with it. That has to do with what has appeared to be rather strong evidence that's been gathered from different sources that there's been a rise in the United States in the last 10 years of what we describe as hate groups, and the violence against different individuals in this country has definitely increased and resulted even in murder. We have experienced that here in the Northwest, and many of you have addressed that before, but I have statistics that indicate that that's happening all over the United States. And the Center for Democratic Renewal in Atlanta is a real excellent organization at gathering such information. Based on that information, would both of our guests today agree that from the sources you have, is that true? And secondly, how can we best in a democratic society deal with all forms of harassment and violence against any of our citizens? Who wishes to take it first?
Well, I'll be brief. Yeah, I think there is an increase of hate group organization, and I think it's reactionary to a growing population in terms of minority group populations. The Hispanic population is growing. The black population is growing. There's more political empowerment for those groups than there was 10 years ago, and I think there is a reaction to that. Those that have fear of these groups feel like they're losing something, and so that seems to be a natural evolution of the process. I think we need, first of all need to recognize that it's there. I think that too many people still are very apathetic about the whole issue of malicious harassment. I think that we in the Northwest, I think, have had to learn very painfully what that is. And I think it's something that the Southeast went through for a long time. They've managed to develop some strategies to overcome it. They haven't overcome it totally. In the Northeast, they say that the problem's not there, but it definitely is there. We in the Northwest have had to face it in terms of some of the extremist groups that have been formed. So, and I don't think it's going to go away. I think we're going to have to develop some strategies that are proactive, that get ahead of the game, if you will. Rather than looking at it in hindsight and saying, well, we should have done this and didn't do that.
So, Anabelle, you would agree with, I know I can say the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations has come to this conclusion, and some of us here, obviously, well, all of us, three here, have been involved with that. There was a very serious and honest discussion at first that you ignore it, that you don't give it publicity, that it may grow in publicity. That doesn't work. It's our experience. And therefore the task force has taken a very different route. Would you agree that that's good advice?
I think so. I think it's time to first of all, there was a gentleman this morning during the session that was at the conference you talked about earlier, that talked about consensus building and conflict resolution. I'm a believer in that. I'm also a believer in that you have to get your emotions out, and I thought there was some good strategies suggested about that. Go ahead and tell your friends and sound off to them, and then start thinking about the ways of working together to overcome these things. And I think that is a very powerful way of overcoming, or if you will, disarming the extremist groups. I think by working together, by sitting down at different symposia, at different forums, at different conferences, and beginning to understand one another, and beginning to give a little bit more of ourselves, we can start to alleviate the fear that creates these things in the first place. Anxiety and fear are what's causing it. I don't think it's anything logical. I don't think it's coming from the head. I think it's all visceral reaction. And the way to deal with visceral reaction is to start deal with anxieties and fears.
Congressman Craig.
I'm not going to disagree with much of what has been said. I guess I have not concentrated on the idea that it is growing nationwide. I know our experience here and the difficulties we've had here in Idaho, and frankly the very strong message Idaho is now sending to the rest of the country of what we are and what we believe as it relates to malicious harassment and those that are involved in it. And I'm awfully proud of my state for what it's done to date, and people like all of you who've stood up and have met the test. And yet at the same time, I just read an article the other day about the Klan and its nearly total demise throughout the South, and that the title of the article was "Klan Paper Tagger Only," that the true, deep organization and structure of the Klan that once existed does not exist today, that it's been largely broken up and largely now is in name only. Now that's according to this article. But at the same time, it is probably fairly reflective of what I understand and have read about it. I think we have different kinds of groups. Clearly we have hate groups. They are visible from time to time. And I would agree that you don't just ignore them. They oftentimes cannot stand the exposure of the light of day or the community's reaction when someone will stand up and openly speak out against them, as this community has obviously done.
Senator Reed.
Yes, a lot of attention, national attention, has been given to the new immigration laws, and I'm very interested in finding out and sharing with our viewers the reactions that both of you have now that we're into the Immigration, is it Reform and Control Act, IRCA? Is that what we call it, IRCA? Now that we're into that for, what, 3 months or so by now? Shall we start with you, Congressman?
Yes, let me start at the beginning. And the beginning is the act itself, the creation of the act, and ultimately the congressional action on it. I opposed it. And I opposed it out of the advice of the Hispanic community of Idaho, who felt it was very discriminatory in light of Hispanics especially. And I felt they were proper in their concern. That, coupled with, I had a great difficulty giving instant amnesty and citizenship to those who had chose to seek it illegally. And that's a gift and a very sacred honor and prize in this country that I don't think need be taken lightly or should be taken lightly. I thought the law handled it a little bit in a cavalier sense. But at the same time, I agreed that if you were going to get a handle on the illegal flow, you had to deal with the employer, and you had to deal with some rather firm employer sanctions. Now, having said all of that, what we tried to do was bring in not only immigration naturalization, but we tried to bring in the Department of Employment. In the case of agricultural employment, we tried to bring in the Department of Agriculture. You know, it's difficult to cause one federal bureaucracy to react in a responsible and timely fashion, let alone 3. Well, it didn't work, and it wasn't working. And we were having great conflicts, and those who were caught in the void were also in conflict. It is working better. A group of 10 of us became very proactive throughout the early spring and summer, forcing the Department of Labor and Immigration Naturalization to go south in Mexico with better forums and communication and education, all that, as it relates to primarily the migrant worker flow throughout the western United States. But the thing about the act that disturbs me most is the assumption that if you are brown-skinned and brown-eyed, you are guilty until proven innocent. And I resent that. Why not blue-eyed and blonde-haired? Because in the ski areas of the nation, we have a lot of European illegals working. And yet they are never victimized by the immigration naturalization because, quote, they look like white America. But if you happen not to look like white America under this law, then you are questioned and you are tested as to your integrity and your presence. And that is, I think, the conflict in the legislation that is now law that I had my greatest difficulty with, and for that reason opposed it.
Anabelle, would you respond, please?
Okay, I think Congressman Craig is right. The Hispanic community did oppose the Immigration and Reform and Control Act, as you called it earlier, IRCA. We opposed it not because we're opposed to immigration reform. We opposed it for similar reasons to the ones you were talking about and some that are at variance with what Congressman Craig is talking about. We opposed the immigration law based on the employer sanctions issue because of the potential discriminatory problems that could occur for Hispanic Americans in terms of being hired or not hired based on the color of their skin. And this, in fact, has proven to be true in several parts of the Southwest. In fact, there are several situations now where class actions can be filed in behalf of Hispanic Americans who have been denied employment because of the employer sanctions portion of the law. The legalization part of the law is a little bit more emotional issue because you're talking about legalizing people that have been here in this country doing the work of this country for a large number of years and now have to go through this process of becoming first, a little better than second-class citizens. They're not really going to become first-class citizens, but they become a little bit better than what they were before. And there's some problems in that. There's a lot of problems in the processing in terms of family unification, the whole thing. And I could get, that's a whole topic for a whole other session. But definitely there's some things that are disturbing about it. I'm glad, Congressman, that you pointed out the massive, well, maybe it's not massive, but the illegal entrance of people that are not of brown skin, because I think that disturbed us most of all. It seems ludicrous to me to have a line of Border Patrol on the southern border, almost arm to arm, and not look at the northern border as well, because some of the people that you're talking about enter through the
22,000 Poles in Chicago alone that don't speak a word of English and are within 3 years of having been from their native home in Poland and did not enter legally. That's in Chicago alone.
Well, Anabelle, you mentioned the emotional issue. Is the Hispanic community then afraid or discouraged or demoralized by the law, or are they complying with it, or are they moving away from it?
I don't think the community is moving away from it. I'm not sure what complying with it means. I think we're working at reforming the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and we're working towards that. In fact, Mayor Henry Cisneros of San Antonio met with a group of Hispanic leaders this week in Washington to establish what we call our Agenda 88, and at the forefront of that agenda is looking at the Immigration Reform Act, and not necessarily, well, if necessary, pushing to repeal it, but looking at it to see where it needs work.
Glenn Walker.
I would just had some thoughts as I was listening to both of you. When we, as Republicans, Congressman Craig and myself, when we get around Lincoln Day, we're always involved in our own rhetoric about freedom and the Party of Freedom and the Party of Lincoln. And the Democrats and their Jefferson-Jackson days, they're talking about the same kinds of things. I would like to see all politicians talk a great deal more about tolerance in a pluralistic society. I don't think we talk enough about that while we talk about freedom in general. But I would like to hear both of you, if you could give me any kind of reaction to the role of the economy in this issue of prejudice and particularly free enterprise. I know, Congressman Craig, you're very supportive, as I am. If you might have any comments on that.
I mentioned when I spoke to the gathering this week, one of my concerns that I think plays a key role in the mainstreaming, if you will, of minorities into a society, and clearly into this society. is the opportunity of upward mobility economically. We have had and will continue to have, as a national policy, a variety of forms of government involvement that will insist on certain things and will provide certain things, be it education, be it work experience, all types of different things to help minorities and underprivileged and underemployed and the poor. But if, when all of that is experienced, the individual cannot gain his or her share of the economic pie, if they can't step into society and find a productive place in society for themselves, then that becomes a very negative experience to them. The one thing that I find in looking at the Hispanic community and the polling that I'm aware of as it relates to the Hispanic attitude in this country, tremendously high sense of upward mobility, a great desire for education, for job opportunity. For example, I'll never forget a very articulate Hispanic lady who came to testify on an environmental issue on the California coast when the legislators of California were trying to ban offshore drilling. And she said, wait a moment. She says, those are my people and those are my jobs. And that's our opportunity to piece of the American pie. Don't stop us from having those kinds of experiences. I applauded her tremendously for that. Well, bottom line is, you've also got to assure, and you can through some government programs, but certainly through affording greater opportunity for the free enterprise system, an expanding, growing economy that provides the job opportunity.
I have to interrupt. We're almost out of time, Anabelle. I'll let you respond.
Okay, I would. I'm gonna be even more pragmatic, I think. We're looking at demographic changes in the United States that will occur over the next 100 years, and we're looking at trying to maintain an economy in this country that keeps us as world leaders. My challenge is this, is that if we do not look at expanding the opportunities for Hispanics, for blacks, for Native Americans, for Asians, for all people in this country, that we're in trouble as a nation if we don't do that. When you look at the projections, population projections for the year 2080, you will see that 49% of the population will be of those groups that I just mentioned.
I'm going to interrupt. I'm so sorry.
Who's going to carry the economy if we don't look at that?
Thank you both for a very informative program, and thank the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, be with us again next week at the same time, and we'll continue this issue. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Thank you.
That's the part that I just...
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.